Hi everyone, and welcome to our fourth episode of Low Carbon, Higher Power. Today I'm joined with Director of Climate Stewards, Caroline Pomeroy. Caroline, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, lovely day. It's good to be here.
And what's it like being the director of a company? That's a lot of responsibility.
We're a company. We're mostly a charity, though. That's our main thing. We're a small organisation. There are 5 of us in the UK, 1 in the Netherlands, 1.5. But yeah, it is. There's always something going on. There's always something to worry about. And we do quite a lot of different things. For a small outfit, we do a lot of different things. So there is lots to think about, yeah.
Yeah. And what brought you to Climate Stewards? Because obviously you didn't set it up, but you're a director. So what brought you here in the first place?
Oh gosh, that's a long story. So I studied land economy to start with. So I was always interested in land and environment, stuff like that. And then shortly after that, I worked as a chartered surveyor in London. And then my husband and I went to live in Rwanda. No, we didn't. We went to live in Ghana, where we worked for Tear Fund, working on an agricultural project, which was fascinating. Just living in the rural areas, seeing a bit of climate change at first hand, but possibly this was in the 90s, mid-90s. Came back and lived in this lovely village of Nunny for a while, had children, got involved, but was always interested and continued to work as a surveyor part-time. Was always interested in the environment. And then got a different job working for Cycle City Guides based in Frome, making cycle maps for cyclists all around the country, working for councils and people like that, working on green travel plans. So I was always interested in this kind of stuff. Then we went to Rwanda, worked for a local charity, Send a Cow, otherwise known as the Ripple Effect now. So we spent 3 years in Rwanda, did lots more environmental stuff. Again, just saw the impact of climate change firsthand. Especially in Rwanda was really interesting because that's a country which is particularly engaged on climate change. They banned plastic bags and switched to low energy light bulbs years ago, way before we did. And you can see the impact of climate change very starkly there because it's a tiny country, it's landlocked, huge amounts of erosion, very intense weather patterns, very high population. So lots of different issues affecting how people survive. So when I got back, I did a master's degree in climate change impact and sustainability. And my dissertation, my research project for that degree was with the Diocese of Bath and Wells.
Oh, wow.
So I worked with the team there at the Old Deanery and the Bishop, and we did a survey of churches across the diocese, 570 churches. And the question was, what are the factors that encourage people to become more or less aware of the environment in their teaching and preaching, their practice? What are the kind of catalysts and the barriers to going green? That was the question. And it was really fascinating. And I did some statistics and tried to work out what the main issues were. Essentially, the big findings of that were bigger, more lively, churches with more people, more buildings, more money, more going on, were better equipped generally to meet the challenge of the environment. And so they were doing more around saving energy, that kind of stuff. And the small rural churches were just struggling to stay afloat. That was kind of the finding. So there wasn't, interestingly, it wasn't about whether, if I would have expected perhaps people in rural areas to have be more aware of the environment. They weren't necessarily. So that was interesting. So having done that degree, I then got this job. So that was a long way to get round to how I got. So they were advertising, Climate Stewards was advertising for a new chief exec, and I got the role. So I've been doing that for the last 12 or 13 years. Yeah.
Wow. And I mean, lots of people in our audience might have never heard of Climate Stewards, or they'd be familiar with maybe the concept of carbon offsetting. But of course, Climate Stewards does a lot more than that as well. Can you give us like a brief kind of overview of what exactly is Climate Stewards about? Like when was this set up? What exactly do they do?
So Climate Stewards was set up by a charity called A Rocha, which runs the Eco Church scheme that people may be familiar with, I hope. And initially it was a project of A Rocha. So A Rocha thought, we're encouraging churches, Christian communities around the world to conserve biodiversity, and carbon offsetting could be a good way to fund this. If we can get people to pay to offset their carbon, they can support these projects. So that's how it kind of started. And in 2010, it became a separate charity from A Rocha, but we're still very much part of the global family. We work closely with a lot of the other A Rocha organisations. And what we do essentially is we help people to measure, reduce and offset their carbon emissions, and also to talk about it and to sort of advocate for climate justice. So the measuring, would you like me to tell you more at this stage about the details?
Go for it, yeah.
Okay, so the measuring, we have online tools on our website.
Yeah.
So we have a carbon footprint calculator for individuals. We have one for churches called 360 Carbon. And we also carry out audits. So we work with bigger organisations. So we work with dioceses, whole dioceses. We work with mission agencies like Tear Fund and BMS, Baptist Missionary Society, and SIL and OMF and the Bible Society and Missions to Seafarers and MAF, who own aeroplanes. So lots of outfits which travel a lot, which fly they have to fly for to exist really. And smaller organisations too, individual churches. But essentially the audits, we work with the bigger outfits. So we do a whole, like an overview of all their carbon emissions, which gives them a really good baseline to say, okay, this is our footprint. What can we do to reduce it? So that's the measuring. Then we encourage people to reduce it. So we work with them on plans and policies and strategies and action plans to take steps to reduce their carbon footprint. And then we enable them to offset it. So we have partner projects in the Global South, currently in 6 countries, so Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, Nepal, Peru, and Uganda.
Wow.
Doing different things, but all of those things either reduce emissions or lock up carbon in the form of trees growing and absorbing carbon. And we help those projects to count and measure how much carbon is being mitigated, avoided, or reduced from taken out of the atmosphere. And then people fund those projects through their offsetting. So it's kind of a circular thing.
Yes.
You're squaring the circle, as it were.
Yeah. So you spend your career, your work, helping other people reduce their emissions. Maybe a bit of a fun question before we start getting into the serious stuff, but is there anything that you do personally to maybe reduce your own carbon footprint or limit, whether that be like travelling or how you travel? Is there anything like that you do?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I do. I try to travel responsibly. We've just got an electric car, and that's been quite a steep learning curve. I know all about range anxiety. I love cycling, and I always try and cycle locally. I've just got an electric bike actually, or a clip-on for my bike to make it more electric. I'll go further and faster. I love walking, that kind of stuff. So yes, using sustainable transport where possible. We've done some quite long trips. I've been to Russia by train. I've been to Croatia by train. I've been to the Alps by train. So long distance travel by train is great, really exciting, really fun. I like to grow vegetables and fruit. So be a bit, try and eat lower down the food chain. And we do eat some meat. We lucky enough to live in a place where we have some sheep and some chickens. Bees, so we eat those products, as it were. But by and large, we don't eat a huge amount of meat, so we eat more vegetables and grains and pulses. For the first time this week, I went on Vinted and I bought myself a new jacket, or a second-hand jacket. And then we have a great WhatsApp group in the village where we just share stuff. It's just called Share Nunny. And so if you want to borrow something, or if you've got something you don't need, people just put it up. So I said, I need a steamer for this jacket, which is all crumpled. And within 5 minutes, I was borrowing somebody's steamer. So trying to be creative about using stuff and not buying new things.
Yeah. And do you? I mean, obviously you have this company or this charity that does carbon offsetting. Do you offset your own emissions as well?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I do. Yeah,
that's really cool. So, in just plain English, for someone like me who's maybe a bit ignorant to what exactly carbon offsetting is, can you explain to myself and the audience what exactly is carbon offsetting?
So we all have a carbon footprint, which is just a way of describing our carbon emissions. And that could be individually as a person or as an organisation like a church or a business or even a nation. And that is really a measure of how much carbon dioxide we are responsible for putting into the atmosphere. And that will include stuff that we burn directly. So if we have like a boiler in our house burning oil, or we're buying gas to run part of our household, or we're buying electricity. So someone elsewhere has burnt the carbon on our behalf, like a coal-fired power station, although that's becoming as we know, renewables are coming in. Anyway, all the different bits of our lives which are responsible for emitting carbon, we add up the emissions from those things. Usually it's over a year. And that includes consumption. So, for example, the clothes we're wearing or the stuff in our house, everything has a carbon footprint from its manufacture, from its transport, etc. So you add that all together and you get a carbon footprint. In the UK, depends how you measure it, but it's currently the average is around about 6, 7, 8, 9 tonnes. If you start including what they call embedded emissions, so that's where if I buy a product made in another country, that will have emissions associated with it. So it would be fair to do that. That seems to be a responsible thing to do. Otherwise, they become some other country's emissions. But if they're my emissions, because I've bought the laptop or whatever, those are my emissions. So that's our footprint. And carbon offsetting is essentially compensating for that footprint. So we've been responsible for, say, 10 tonnes of CO2 going into the atmosphere. We could just let it build up in the atmosphere, and that, as you know, that's a global warming gas.
Yes.
And there are other greenhouse gases too, which are more potent and they add into the mix anyway. The mixture of greenhouse gases needs to be tempered, as it were, by our offsetting. So offsetting is either removing emissions through, and that's either through something sort of technical means like carbon capture and storage, sort of big technical stuff, or generally, in our case, it's through growing trees, which, as you know, as they grow, or any plant will lock up carbon, but trees lock it up for more than a season.
Sure. Yeah.
Or reducing what otherwise would have been emitted. So if you've got, for example, a solar panel, that's replacing grid electricity which was generated through burning coal. That is you're getting the same amount of electricity like we work with charities who have hospitals across Africa, so they can get that electricity through solar panels rather than through coal-fired power stations or fuel-efficient stoves. We also fund those. So a poor household in Nepal or in Peru where we work, they would otherwise be cooking on a 3-stone fire and burning fuel, which then emits carbon dioxide. By using a more efficient stove, they're using about half the amount of fuel. Wow. So, of course, that saves. So what we're doing is we're counting the savings from those things. Yeah. Similarly, with water filters, where a family might have boiled water to make it safe to drink, and then they don't have to boil water because they have a filter. Again, what you're counting is the difference against the baseline. What's the saving? So that's how you calculate carbon savings. And offsetting is essentially funding those savings. Yes. So it's basically, I say my footprint's 10 tonnes. I'm going to pay some money to support projects which will remove 10 tonnes from the atmosphere. And that's kind of squaring the circle, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, you practically answered my next question because I was, again, like I've historically, I guess, before I came into this role, I always thought that offsetting, money well spent on a university education, I guess, but I always thought it was just planting trees. I thought if you're going to offset, that is literally it. But then when you start looking into the carbon accounting, again, doing all the stuff with the energy footprint tool, when people have solar panels, it does offset it and it counts. But I remember when I first met you and you spoke to me about the stoves in Nepal, I thought that was just like amazing. Like, what an amazing project. Like how projects like that, how... Like, does that set Climate Stewards apart? Is that something that is exclusive that you do as an organisation, or is that something that's quite common in other offsetting organisations? Most offsetting organisations will fund a range of things, and some of them are just trees, very, very large scale tree planting. Some of them will do technology projects or a mixture of the two, as we do. I think what sets us apart, probably a couple of things. One is that we're very small scale, so we work really close to the ground. So we really know our partners. We have regular Zoom calls or whatever with them. We support them. We help them to get projects off the ground because they're quite difficult. These projects, they're compared to another type of most development projects. There's a lot more counting and measuring that needs to take place. These trees need to stay alive in the long term, and that means that you have to take account of all the risks of things that can go wrong. They might burn down, they might be chopped down, they might get pests, they might have drought or floods which kill them. So you have to take all of those things into account, and we basically build in big risk buffers. So we're very cautious in our approach, so we don't overestimate the carbon that we're anticipating from those trees. And similarly with technology projects, things go wrong. People stop using technology, it breaks, they forget, they lose it, whatever. So there are lots of different
factors that need to be taken into account. And I guess we are what sets us apart is we're very cautious because we're very realistic about local communities adopting all these different technologies. We work only through local partner organisations. We don't have any staff overseas. So these are people who are already doing these things, and we are funding that and helping them do it well and measure it. We also work with and through Christian and church organisations in the Global South, almost exclusively. It's actually quite difficult to find the right types of organisations to partner with in every country, but wherever we can, we work through Christian organisations, so they share our vision, our values, and I think they see the kind of wider benefits, so that the funding mechanism is carbon offsetting, but the benefits to the local community are improved health, improved biodiversity, maybe they save money, they save time gathering firewood, there are lots of other local impacts which are positive, which people get benefits from, even though they can't necessarily see the carbon being taken out of the atmosphere. So that's a wider global benefit.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because again, my next sort of questions are perhaps a negative tone, but I'm hoping, again, having met you before and had this conversation about carbon offsetting and the positives it can generate, like in the actual communities it's happening. It's quite fascinating, but there's been quite a bit of negative press around offsetting in the past, and you can understand why. Like, there's a difference between good offsetting and bad offsetting. But I thought I'd pose a question to you. And what do you say to people that think carbon offsetting is just greenwashing, or a means of wealthy people paying money to avoid making sustainable changes?
It's a good question, and it can be both of those things, I'd say. George Monbiot, the environmentalist, he calls offsets papal indulgences. So we're kind of like paying someone else to do our dirty work for us, or sort of exporting our carbon emissions to somewhere else. A license to pollute is another good one. So yeah, I think if offsetting is purely used to continue our current behaviour and then just sort of erase our guilty conscience, that's not a good use of offsetting. I think offsetting, when used well, is a responsible way to deal with unavoidable carbon emissions. So if we can't do anything about it, if we're working on reducing, but there's time or money involved in that process, or there is just no lower we can go as an individual organisation, then what can we do with the rest? And that's where offsetting comes in. So it should be kind of like the last piece of the jigsaw, rather than the first. Yeah.
So when you work with if an organisation approaches you and says we'd like to do some carbon offsetting, do you ever get like an inkling that they're maybe doing it in a negative way rather than doing it? It's like you said, like the last piece of the puzzle, like they've done all they can to reduce their emissions. Do you ever get things like that? Is there any way you can safeguard against that as well? So like if you have an organisation approach, maybe you don't know the organisation because they're not high profile, but they've come to you and they have loads of evidence that they've got a big net zero program maybe. Is there any way you can safeguard against that stuff?
We do due diligence on our larger offsetting partners. So, for example, we have said no to one or two.
Interesting.
One of them was, I won't name them, but it was a bank or a bit of a department in a bank, an international bank, and that bank was also funding an oil pipeline in East Africa,
right?
And had some understandably quite bad press about that. And we looked at that quite carefully, and we said, this doesn't feel like, this is not comfortable for us. Doesn't seem that this is not matching up. So we said, thank you, but no thank you. We'd rather not work with you. It's difficult because all of us are kind of we're kind of inevitably involved in being responsible for carbon emissions. For sure. You can't really live in this world, and certainly not in the UK, without having a carbon footprint. And some of us will fly for lots of different reasons. And, so it would be very hypocritical for me to say, nobody can ever fly again or whatever, or our partners can't. But I think we find that pretty much everyone who comes to us, except one or two exceptions, both individuals and organisations, are doing it because they care. And they're really concerned, and they are trying to decarbonise what they can. But they recognise there's a bit they'll never be able, or they can't at the moment decarbonise, or they'll never be able to. And they'll say, okay, I want to be responsible. I want to kind of own those emissions. And I want to pay. And in answer to your question a bit, also, we're not the cheapest around. So if you just want to do it and tick the box, you could go somewhere else. Because we try and do it well.
Yes.
So,
And I think that's really important as well. I guess like further emphasising what sets you apart as well, like the importance of doing it right. And like I said before, there's a difference between good and bad offsetting. And it's obviously really important, not just for, I guess, the business model, if you will, but like actually creating an impact that you're doing it right.
Yeah.
I have a question, a personal one. I was thinking hard about this one. And again, it might just be me being ignorant, because I don't know overly loads about offsetting. But I did have a question, because I have, just through my experience with it, there's been something that hasn't like quite sat right with me about offsetting. So somehow it doesn't seem right that offsetting projects for wealthy nations and organisations are almost always in developing countries. So this is a two-part question. So one, why can't wealthy organisations just offset in their own country? So can they not just do projects there? And then two, which you've kind of answered already, but if you want to go into a bit more depth in this, you can. Do offsetting projects actually provide any benefit to the host country where it's happening?
Yeah, as you say. So why we can't do it here? So people often say to us, why can't you just plant trees in England? Well, you can plant trees in England, but they grow a lot slower.
Yes.
So I would say we have a climate emergency, and the next decades are really critical. It doesn't matter where in the world you plant trees or do your offsetting. We have the atmosphere is what they call a global commons. We share it. It doesn't matter where you take the carbon and dioxide out. So if you're going to plant trees in the tropics where they're growing at ridiculous rates sometimes, just you wouldn't believe how fast trees will grow. I remember going to Ghana a few years ago and looking to visit our partner projects there and seeing like a 6-year-old tree which was 20 metres high and sort of diameter of like that. You know, in England it would be just, you'd probably be able to, about as tall as me. So if you want to get, you know, lots of impact, you could go to countries where things grow fast. That's obviously not, you have to do that wisely, and you're not just kind of going and planting trees all over the place and not taking account of local people's views.
Sure.
So that's why we work really closely with local communities. So we generally plant trees, for example, on ground owned by schools and churches where they have a sort of defined boundary. They have fences which are useful against the goats and stuff like that, theft. And people are learning as well in that environment, so they're sort of seeing how things grow and what the impacts are and how it stabilises the soil and reduces the local temperature and produces fruit and bark and all sorts of stuff. So the local benefits are really important. So yes, there will be technical fixes that people, as you know, are planning carbon capture and storage. There are ways in which we could be offsetting and should be offsetting in this country and the whole of the Western world, you know, who are largely responsible for carbon emissions. But if we can actually use this as a mechanism to benefit and bless our poorer global neighbours who are feeling the impacts of climate change first and worst, then that's a great win-win to me.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, in terms of what we have to do to tackle, you know, our current emissions trajectory is here and we've got to get to here and you've got to do everything. You've got to do this and this and this and this and this and this. So you've got to do, and offsetting one of those things. Offsetting in the majority world is one of those things. But yeah.
Yeah. And again, you spoke about community, and to me, I don't like to see offsetting. I mean, it's great. Let me rephrase. I love seeing offsetting projects when they're, you know, it's huge tree planting projects. I mean, that's really awesome. But I do like to see, again, that's why Climate Stewards is so attractive to me, is those sort of community-based projects as well, like things like the stoves, or even if you do a smaller scale tree planting. How do you ensure? Because obviously you I guess almost act, from my perception, I might be wrong, but almost like a middle person there. So so organisations and people will pay you for offsetting to be done, and then you kind of have to safeguard and make sure that happens. How do you make sure it's community-led stuff and it's not this top-down approach?
Yeah, so again, I think through working through local partners, so they're really on the ground, and some of them are actual church organisations. Mostly, they're connected with churches, and I think in this job, initially I used to slightly apologise for being connected with church especially when I was talking to non-church related organisations, I'd be a bit sort of hesitant about mentioning it. But increasingly, I think, no, actually, the church is there for the long term. You know, the church is in every community around the world. There's a church, pretty much, and there many development. I've lived and worked overseas with other development agencies, and you see people coming in and out. They're 2 years, 3 years, and then they go, and then the project falls apart. The church is not like that. The church is there for forever, you know, and so. That's a really strong, I think, a strong argument for working with and through local churches is that they're not just in the community, they are the community. They're just part, and the staff members live there, and you know, they're not just coming in and out and trying to solve problems and going away. So that's one big factor that I think is a real benefit of working with and through local churches. How do you ensure high quality? So we have for our what we call the seal of approval, which is our carbon framework. There are some really big carbon frameworks standards out there, gold standard, VCS, Vera, those kind of things. We are not those people. There's lots of good things about them, but they also do operate at a very big scale. They're very expensive, really, really expensive, tens of thousands of pounds to put things through them. Our projects doesn't make sense to do that. So we want to bring more money to the local partner organisation, but also be really rigorous and robust and transparent and conservative. So we have a set of it's like an detailed application form. We have a risk buffer matrix. We have a risk matrix buffer, risk matrix from which we calculate a buffer. A work plan. We do a detailed budget, which will last for 10 or 15 years because we can't just go in and out and assume the trees are going to stay there or the cook stoves are going to stay being used. You know, all of those things. So a lot of the budget for our projects is in the successive years. So it's the monitoring and the reporting. So it has to go on a long time. Yeah. So we have lots of ways in which we try and make sure that we are being really cautious and honest about our calculations.
I want to talk to you about how appropriate offsetting is for, I guess, in terms of size. So obviously you work with organisations, but you also work with individuals and small groups as well. The kind of sites I'm dealing with for my role, schools and churches, I mean, a lot of them are really engaged with things like net zero, and you have so many churches switching to infrared heating, or you get schools switching over to heat pumps. Yeah. But as we've discussed previously, you're always going to have some form of a carbon footprint. So whether that be 2 tons, 3 tons, I mean, something quite small. Are those kind of sites, so schools and churches, are they appropriate for carbon offsetting, do you think?
Anybody can carbon offset. I mean, we get about a third of our income comes from individuals who just want to offset their family footprint, for example, or maybe they're going on a special trip, they're flying on holiday or to visit relatives or to go to a wedding, or the things that people fly for, which they wouldn't normally do, perhaps. But in terms of schools and churches, we have a number of churches, and we're talking to a school at the moment, but they're measuring their footprint using the EFT and or our footprint calculator, which captures a wider range of the church activities. And then some of them are, not hundreds, because I think that the route map to net zero, as you know, for the Church of England is very much focused on cutting emissions first and then offsetting when we get nearer to 2030. But a number of churches, I mean, large numbers of churches are already choosing to offset some of their emissions. Sometimes it's maybe just their travel or the sort of buildings, the energy stuff. This is all voluntary, so people can choose what they want to offset. But I think what they're saying is this is actually an incentive, because if you're paying to offset and then you reduce, you're going to pay less next year. So it's quite a good way of budgeting in a way. You're saying, actually, this is a cost that we want to try and reduce, so let's make it a cost. Otherwise, you're externalising that cost. So someone's paying, society is paying, the planet's paying. Yeah. So let's own that and be responsible for it.
And how much does it, I don't know if there's like an approximate, I guess it's dependent, but how much does it cost to offset? Say I have, a 5-ton carbon footprint that I can't avoid. Yeah, sure. Is it affordable for an individual to do?
So through Climate Stewards, our cost to offset is £25 a tonne. Okay. So if your 5 tonnes would be £125. So if you flew to, I don't know, New York for a weekend, that's about 2 tons.
Right,
so that would be
okay.
£50. I mean, that's not that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Churches, I mean, as you know, churches' footprints vary enormously. There could be some which are like 1 or 2 tons because they barely, they're tiny and rural and they don't do very much. And some will have hundreds of tons. So, that basically multiply by 25, and that's the cost to offset.
And I know you said obviously some churches have taken this up. Like, have you ever had any big churches do it? So, like any of the large ones where you've got, I mean, in our diocese we've got, I mean, some with like 50 tons, which is, I mean, it's not a trivial amount. But do you get bigger churches, or do you find it smaller churches that often do?
No, it's a real range. We've got some tiny churches; they're literally offsetting 1 or 2 tons. And I think if you're going through eco-church, when you get to gold, one of the questions is, have you done your carbon? Have you used 360 carbon to get the full footprint? And have you offset? So, and obviously, there are other offsetting organisations that are available. People can go to other offset outfits. But some of them have come to us. So, yes, some of those bigger gold eco-churches are coming to Climate Stewards to offset. Yeah.
So, you mentioned there the 360 carbon tool again. Now, at parish level, we have energy footprint tool, which, I mean, I guess the idea of it is it's accessible and people can fill it in, but it's not the most sophisticated tool. And I like the 360 carbon tool. Can you talk a little bit about how, I mean, individuals, myself and Harry, could take action by using that tool?
Sure. So 360 carbon is for it's not for individuals, it's for organisations.
Okay,
so there's Footprinter, which is for an individual. So if you or Harry were going on holiday or just wanted to do your annual footprint from your car mileage, your household energy, your holidays, your consumption, all of that, you could do that. And you just work through it, ask you questions like, what were your energy bills? What's your car mileage? What type of car have you got? How do you heat your house? How much money do you spend every week or month or year on different activities? And it adds it all up, basically, and it extrapolates a footprint. It's not perfect, but it's a really good estimate, because ultimately you're using cost data to get a carbon footprint. For 360, it's the same principle, but it's just done for a group, like an organisation, so for a church, say. So you would be, like with the energy footprint tool, you'd be measuring your bills, your energy bills, but then you'd also be doing travel. And we have a travel survey for congregations, so you can get everyone working out how they get to church, and then the idea obviously is to stimulate people to think, what could we do what could we do differently to make this lower? So with church, could we do car sharing? Could we get the bus? Have we got a bike rack? All those sorts of questions. And then other travel, so public transport, etc. There'll be some of that, and then expenditure. So it's all designed for churches, so there's lots about tea, biscuits, coffee and squash. We did one for synagogues recently, and that was whiskey, smoked salmon and something else. So different cultures have different, eat different things, which is great. But yeah, so how much money do you spend on all these different activities? Food, and then stuff like the photocopier or the mowing of the churchyard, and all the different activities churches tend to put in their budget. So we can apply a carbon footprint to all those different activities, so you can get a whole picture of what is our footprint. Because
I know I think it must be WWF's carbon footprint calculator. It fires some ideas how you can. It gives you your footprint, and however big it is, and however ashamed you feel of it, it gives you some ideas of stuff you can do to reduce that. Do you have that on the? We don't currently. We have a resources page on our website with lots of ideas and links to other people, and then we also obviously talk about if people want to offset, we take them to our offset page. But you don't have to. The footprint tools are free to use on the website, so that's optional. Okay. Yeah. So in your time that you've been director of Climate Stewards, what's been you might have a handful, but what's been the most successful project that you've been a part of so far? I think, most of our overseas partnerships have been have done really well. A few haven't, for the sort of reasons I mentioned earlier. Sometimes tree projects, you have to really make sure there's very good local management. So we had one group of churches, in fact it was an Anglican sort of network in Uganda, where there was just not enough local ownership of the project. So it felt like they'd been slightly imposed from outside and they weren't well managed. And although there were some great people doing really good work, we weren't confident that those trees would really
well, they wouldn't. Many of them did die, and we weren't confident that they would survive in big enough numbers. So we basically kind of ceased supporting that project. But the ones that have worked, I mean, I think the Nepal cook stoves, which you've mentioned, and if you go on our website, you can see the photos. They are amazing, the before and after photos. I think there's something about that because, especially as a woman, the before and after photographs show people cooking indoors in a cold climate on a 3-stone fire. So you can imagine it was a sealed room, smoke everywhere, no chimney. And so they had huge problems with heart, lung and eye disease. And also and then the stigma of being unwell. There's all sorts of stuff around that, quite apart from having to walk further and further and further to get enormous quantities of fuel for these stoves, which are very hungry because they're not just cooking, they're also keeping the room warm in the cold weather. So the transformation those stoves bring is really dramatic. And we've had third parties to go out and monitor and visit those communities and to confirm, basically, that those projects are just life-changing. And similarly, seeing trees, particularly in Ghana and Kenya, where our partners have been going quite a few years now, just seeing the size and the scale of trees. In Ghana, our partners work closely with local schools and, seeing kids motivated. They run environment clubs in the schools, so teachers are involved and the children are motivated and seeing things grow and taking them home. And it's just really great to see that it is possible to kind of, for the pendulum to swing back again.
Yeah. Do you know what your biggest project is at the moment in terms of size?
In terms of budget, it's Nepal, because the stoves are very expensive. Big, heavy, solid stoves, because they last for decades, literally. In terms of numbers of trees in Ghana, that would be our biggest partner, and that's Arusha, Ghana, so that's an Arusha partner.
Okay. Do you know how much, so for those projects, do you know how, like, the level of carbon that's accounting for?
So since 2017, when we started this new way of measuring carbon, we've mitigated about 75,000 tonnes of carbon as an organisation through all of those different partnerships. And about half of that, just over half of that, is through trees, and the rest is through technology.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Do you have any projects maybe on the horizon that you're quite excited about?
I think at the moment, and we talked about this, I think, before, but the world of carbon is changing a bit. So as a result of the Paris Agreement, there's a thing called Article 6, which is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is all about the world getting to net zero, which is a really good thing. And essentially, it's requiring countries to kind of ratchet down their carbon emissions year on year on year on year and make commitments to that. And also to measure what they're capable of mitigating and what they're emitting. The challenge for us is that Climate Stewards model doesn't quite fit that. We don't quite fit that mould. Mm-hmm. So this year is a year of change for us, I think. It's a year of transition to working out how our projects, which we think are great and we want to do more of, and I think lots of other people think the same, how they fit within that new landscape, that changing landscape. So that's our priority. We're also working with the Anglican Communion and Anglican Alliance on a pilot project for this whole net zero thing. So one of my having worked with the diocese many years ago, and realising that net zero was coming, how do we as churches mitigate our carbon? We could just pay Climate Stewards or some third party to offset when we get to 2030 and beyond. Or we could develop really good partnerships with our partner dioceses in the Global South, which would bring multiple benefits like ours to those places. So last year we got some funding for that, working with the Anglican Alliance, and we've got one project in Kenya currently, which is planting trees with a theological training college and a church. So it's a pilot for this concept of how could a diocese work with another diocese and prepare the ground, as it were, for carbon offsetting, so that when we get to 2030, we've got projects up and running that can absorb more money and therefore carbon, and also bring all those other benefits that we've talked about. And I think because we've been doing this for 15 years, we've got a lot of experience in how to manage and set up those projects well. Yeah. So I think that, for me, is going to be the next focus.
Yeah. And can people stay up to date with that? Is that on your website or the Anglican Alliance website that people can stay up to date with that?
So I think we publish a newsletter every 2 months. We have social media feeds. So sign up for our newsletter. keep an eye out. Yeah.
I don't want to ask you questions about the practical pathway to net zero, but obviously offsetting is going to play a part in the Church of England's net zero targets. But I guess broadly speaking about, not just the Church of England, the Anglican community, is there anything at the moment, I guess, like in the whole world that's really exciting you in terms of climate action? Like, is there anything going on in our world that you're thinking like, wow, like that's just incredible and inspiring for yourself?
It's quite hard to be excited about climate action at the moment. I think overall what inspires me about working in this space is that Christians make up about 2.5 billion people, I think. Is that the right number? Which is about a third of the world's population. And if every church in every community, and there are churches in pretty much every community in the world, got it about creation care, which was the phrase we tend to use. And that's not just carbon, it's the whole environmental piece, biodiversity and everything else. If that was just normal mainstream Christian understanding and teaching, just woven in with everything else. And if you start reading the Bible, I would argue it's in there everywhere, but people tend to sort of filter it out. They look for the sort of me and God stuff, and they forget, and they sort of talk about me and God, me and my neighbours, but they rather forget about me and the land, or us and the land. And I think if that theology, which I think is mainstream biblical teaching, kind of came back, I think it used to be there and it's kind of got a bit lost, then that would have an enormous, that really could transform everything. Because I think if local churches were just doing this, like every church was an eco-church around the world effectively, what a difference that would make. And that whole thing about, I was saying to someone the other day, what does loving your neighbour mean? That's a pretty fundamental rule. There's like the golden rule, isn't it? It's not even just Christianity. It's most mainstream religions would say the same thing. If I love my global neighbour, who's most impacted by climate change, and my future neighbour, so my grandchildren or whatever, who will be more impacted by climate change, and my non-human neighbour, which is possibly extending the metaphor a bit far, but I think maybe, anyway, the rest of creation, then I will, and if I act accordingly, that should change the way we all behave. And I think what excites me really is that the Christian church has huge potential to make a massive difference. And I do see that happening in certain places at certain times.
Wow. I do like to end things on a great bit of theology. That is really fantastic. Thank you. Well, thanks, Caroline. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
It's really interesting. I'm sure our audience will find this really interesting as well. And thank you to our audience. And we will be back next month for our 5th episode. See you later.
Bye.